place. But Geoffrey Bawa brought more than jurisprudence to the jury system here at the AA. He was an incredible impetus and a force that caused us, I think, all to reassess our own positions. There was much talk at that time about socialism, about equality, about social purpose. There were housing schemes which got published at great length in the magazines. But big Mr. Bawa had a very different program. His design presentations were characterized not just by the white Rolls Royce that drew up outside number 36 Bedford Square, and out of which the minions would come carrying the drawings to be put on the panels, but also the whole idea of presentation being done so professionally and purchased, as it were, for display on the jury board of the AA. But having said that, the finished drawings, which still come from his office, and they're usually pretty wonderful by the many generations, some of whom are here tonight, many generations of students and assistants that have worked for him. They were beautiful, beautiful presentations, brilliant concepts, which were finished with a kind of character which is entirely in keeping with the man. 2 years ago, when I was in Sri Lanka working with Minette de Silva on her abortive book, or hopeful book for the future, I was sitting in the Gullface Hotel looking out of my window, and it wasn't a white Rolls Royce this time, it was a pink Mercedes that was coming round the corner. I guessed, I knew who it was. I just had that hunch, this must be, yes it was. And before the evening was out, there he was, talking about architecture to an entirely interested audience of German diplomats who were in the Goethe Institute at that particular time and spending their evening with a reception at the Gullface. Between the Rolls-Royce and the Mercedes, there have been a remarkable output of projects, some of which I've seen and many of the members of this audience. Incredibly sensitive designs fitting into that verdant landscape of Sri Lanka. Original, and as Ken Frampton would say, entirely critically regional. I think this is what David Robson is going to talk a little bit about tonight. He's well informed about Geoffrey Bawa and is, if I can use the legal word, officially, I think, the biographer of the book on Bawa. He's well known to AA students, particularly in the graduate school, and of course he has lectured for many years at the University of Brighton. David Robson. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could we have the first slides, please? Last Wednesday, Sri Lanka celebrated the 50th anniversary of its independence from after 450 years of domination by first the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then the British. And happily, Prince Charles was there for the celebrations on our behalf. And you may have seen his photograph in the paper looking rather hot and tired and bored. And the newspapers did report that he slipped away early from the celebrations. In fact, what they didn't say was that he slipped away early in order to drive 60 miles for an audience with Geoffrey Bawa in Lunaganga. Although their island is now divided by an interminable civil war and their economy is under siege, Sri Lankans can still look back at some positive achievements from the last 50 years, not least among them the buildings of Bawa, their most significant and prolific homegrown architect. 1948 also witnessed the beginnings of Bawa's architectural odyssey. As Ceylon was slipping uneventfully out of the British Empire, Bawa returned home after 10 years of exile and bought a derelict rubber estate at Lunaganga, which was to kindle his interest in landscape and architecture. This is the estate at Lunaganga. This seems therefore to be a very appropriate moment. In Sri Lanka, one would use the word auspicious, to pay tribute to Geoffrey Bawa's achievements. 50 years of independence, 50 years of architecture. Geoffrey Bawa was born in Colombo in 1919. He was the second son of Benjamin Bawa, a successful and wealthy Muslim lawyer, and his Dutch burgher wife, Marion Cameron Schrader. Bawa's father died during a family visit to London in 1922, and so he was brought up by his mother in a large colonial mansion in the centre of Colombo. Although not burghers in the strictest sense, the Bawas belonged to that group of people in between, neither fully Asian nor fully European, who had prospered during the later period of British rule, and who for a brief period constituted the core of Colombo's indigenous educated elite. In 1938, Bawa came to Britain and read English at Cambridge. Later, he turned to the law, and in 1943 was called to the bar in London. Then in 1945, he returned to Ceylon to be with his mother, who was seriously ill, and he worked for a time in a Colombo law firm. However, after his mother's death in 1946, he abandoned the legal profession and set off on 2 years of travel, which took him first through the Far East, across the United States, and eventually to Europe. Finally, at the end of 1947, he came to a temporary halt in Italy and decided to settle down there for good, in a farmhouse overlooking Lake Garda. There seemed to be little to draw him back to Sri Lanka. Both his parents were dead. He had spent more than a third of his life away from home, and although he was only half European by descent, he seemed to be wholly European in outlook. But this plan to buy an Italian farm fell through, and so Bawa returned to Ceylon, where almost on the rebound he bought this old rubber estate near Bentota and set out to transform it into a landscape garden, a process which soon transformed him from restless traveller and reluctant lawyer into builder and gardener. This garden project fired his imagination, but laid bare his lack of technical knowledge. His growing interest in building prompted a cousin to suggest that he ought to train to become an architect, so that you can do what you like doing best using other people's money. And that seemed to be quite good advice. In 1951, he embarked on a trial apprentice with a man called H.H. Reid, who was the sole surviving partner of a firm of Colombo architects called Edwards Reid Begg. This was a practice which had been founded in 1923 by S.J. Edwards. Reid, in fact, died at the end of 1951, and in 1952, Bawa returned to England and engaged a tutor in Cambridge to teach him structural design. In the following year, he applied to the AA and was accepted, I don't know how, but he was accepted directly into third year by Michael Patrick. And Bawa was the oldest student in the school at the time, and he was certainly the tallest. He's remembered for his striking appearance, his Rolls Royce, and his argumentative debates with tutors. And he spent his fourth year in John Killick's unit and took part in a study of Islington, producing this design for housing in Holloway Road, which was published in the AD. But his final year was spent largely in Rome, from where he would occasionally drive back at breakneck speed to put in a rare appearance at Bedford Square. And he finally qualified in 1957 at the age of 38, and then returned to Ceylon, where he almost immediately took over the practice of Edwards Reid Begg. Now, as I said, Edwards founded this practice in about 1923. He was a graduate of the AA. He had been based in Singapore, but he won the competition for Colombo Town Hall, and that's the Colombo Town Hall on the left. That's a boys' school on the right that they designed. They were the most prolific practice in Sri Lanka, and in fact in that region in the 20s and 30s. This is the Kalenia Temple, a Buddhist temple on the left by Edwards Reid Begg, and the Gaul Face Court Flats on the right. But by the time Geoffrey Bawa returned to set up the practice, to take over the practice, all of the partners were dead, and the practice was more or less moribund. Bawa gathered around himself a group of young designers and artists, including the painter Laki Senanayake, the designer Barbara Sansoni, the batik artist Ina de Silva. This is Ina de Silva on the left, a recent photograph of her, all of whose work figures prominently in buildings designed by the practice. In 1958, he was joined by the young Ulrich Plesner, that's the man on the right, a Danish architect who was to play a very important role in the practice during the first decade. Plesner was a charismatic character who brought with him an appreciation of Scandinavian design and tempered with an interest in Buddhism and a curiosity about Sri Lanka's building traditions. Bawa is an unrepentant eclectic, and it's difficult to pin down his influences. He himself mentions English country houses and their gardens, the Alhambra in Granada, the forts of Rajasthan, the palaces of Kerala, buildings of Cambridge and Rome. He was also very much affected by the enthusiasm for Korb and Mies, which prevailed in the AA during the mid-50s. But he also acknowledges his debt to classical Sinhalese architecture and to the later vernacular traditions which evolved from the fusion of medieval building with the styles of the Portuguese, the Dutch and the British. These are just a few slides to show something of the rich architectural inheritance of Sri Lanka. On the left, the citadel palace of Sigiriya. On the right, a round Buddhist Vata Daga or roofed Dagaba. So the classical period of Sri Lanka was very sophisticated. This is the medieval period, a 14th century temple of Dambadenya. And here, an example on the left of a Portuguese building used at that time, when I took the picture, as a Hindu temple, but it's now been destroyed. On the right, a building from the Dutch period, a Dutch fort in Matara. And on the left, clearly, a building of the British colonial period. And on the right, the latest invasion, the Singaporean capitalist or commercial architecture. We might define Bawa's first period as stretching from 1958 until 1970, a period of growing political instability. Post-colonial consensus had first been shaken by the election of the nationalist SWRD Bandaranaike in 1956 and was finally shattered by his assassination in 1959. So during the 1970s, governments came and went with some regularity, and the economy went into decline. Importantly for Bawa, imported building materials and components were in short supply, and it was often necessary to improvise. Buildings were constructed with few drawings, and much of the design would be worked out on-site with the bas, or craftsman. Bawa has built a total of over 50 houses in Sri Lanka during the past 40 years, and throughout this time, these houses have acted as a sort of test bed for his ideas, and his own two houses have been the sort of primary experimental bed. One of Bawa's early preoccupations was to develop alternatives to the British colonial bungalow, the single-volume, multicellular villa standing at the centre of a large plot. Colombo's urban population was exploding, and we should remember that during the last 50 years, this period of independence, the population of Colombo has risen from 500,000 to 3 million. So one of the problems was that land was increasingly in short supply, plot sizes were shrinking, and that the British isolated villa type was no longer viable. Before 1960, building plots of 1,000 square metres were the norm in Colombo for middle-class families, and the minimum permitted size under municipal bylaws was 350 square metres. But by 1970, Bawa had developed models which demonstrated that one could live comfortably and elegantly on as little as 150 square metres. In the end, there were two principal models, which I'll show you. One is the courtyard type, and the other, the tower house, the house on a small plot which rises above its surroundings. Now, Geoffrey Bawa's first house was built in 1958 for a family called Verandah, but it was commissioned in 1952, a year before he came to England, and it was, in fact, 4 or 5 years in gestation. The Verandaghs were a very interesting client for him to have because they had one foot in the sort of feudal traditional camp. They were a very old family, but they were also very modern in outlook. Paul Verandah had been educated at Cambridge, he was a zoologist, he was the director of the museum, and they wanted a house, and they knew what they didn't want. They didn't want a British sort of house, beautiful, colonial Dunroman sort of house, which everybody was building in Colombo at that time. But they weren't very sure about what they did want. They wanted something which would be modern, in keeping with the spirit of independence, but they also wanted something which would refer back to the houses that they had grown up in. And they couldn't find an architect until somebody said, oh, there's this young man called Bawa who wants to be an architect. Perhaps he's the man for you. And they met Geoffrey Bawa and commissioned him to design a house. And they insisted that he looked first at this house, which was their feudal home. This is the Ekneli Goda Walawe. Walawe means manor house. It was built in the beginning of the 19th century for the Verandah family near to Ratnapura. And you can see that it's a house with a large courtyard at the back. It has verandas at the front, a very large, expansive veranda at the front, another veranda to the rear into the courtyard. That's the rear courtyard. There are side verandas, the rear veranda, and this large courtyard, which is called the Meda Medulla. And this was the feudal home of the Verandaghs. You can see from the front elevation that although perhaps the concept was Sri Lankan, there was much in this which had to do with Portuguese and Dutch architecture. That's the front veranda on the left, and the rear veranda on the right. And this is the courtyard, and just a detail of a window. The Verandaghs were also the guardians of the local temple at Ratnapura. This is called the Saman Dewale. A Dewale is a peculiar temple. It's sort of half Buddhist and half Hindu. It's the temple of the god of Adam's Peak, or the Peak Wilderness, the god Saman. And you can see it has a sort of pagoda-like building in the middle of a compound. And the Verandaghs insisted that Geoffrey saw these buildings, and that there would be something that he would incorporate from them in the house that he was designing for them. Well, after a few months, Bawa went to the Verandaghs and said, I'm very sorry, I can't do it. I've got lots of ideas, but I just can't get them all to work. And I've decided you have to get another architect. I'm going to England and I'm going to study architecture. And the Verandaghs' reaction was quite surprising. They said, well, yes, we understand, but we like your ideas. You go to England, we'll wait. And they waited for 5 years. And he came to London, he studied at the AA, and they waited. And when he returned and joined this practice of Edwards Reid Begg, the first project that he did was this house for the Verandaghs. Now, that sounds like a story which should have a happy ending, but in fact, sadly, the Verandah house was a bit of a disappointment. I think it was a disappointment to the Verandaghs and to Geoffrey, because he still hadn't really found the means to realize the ideas which were in his head. Already what he's done, he's taken the idea of a single villa and he's broken it into 3 pieces. And we see here 2 of the pieces with a long entrance loggia veranda which runs between them to the 3rd piece. And these 3 pieces create half-enclosed courtyards. But it's not quite what Geoffrey was working towards. This is the interior of the Deranagala house from 1958. The next house, or there were 2 or 3 more in between, but the next significant house was what we always call the Ash de Silva house, a house for a doctor called A.S.H. de Silva. And this is in Gaul. And the slide on the left shows a page from the Architectural Review of 1966. This was the first magazine article to describe Bawa's work. It was done by J.M. Richards. It shows 6 or 7 of his buildings. But this is the A.S.H. de Silva house as it was when it was built on the left. And you can see that the plan, there is at the bottom of a hill where there's a road, and at the bottom of the hill there's the doctor's surgery, and then there's this strange raking corridor which links up to the main house, which is around a central courtyard. Here is a wing for the client's sister, and then a long wing goes towards the kitchen and the servants' rooms. And it's been compared to a sort of Miesian type of plan, but it's on a slope, and where there would have been in a European house a solid core of a hearth, here the core is a void, a courtyard. This on the right is the entrance space, a pool, and a staircase that goes up to the sister's apartment. This is a photograph taken last year. And here is the main living room, and you can see through it to the central courtyard, and on the left the raking wall that links down to the doctor's surgery. And this is the central courtyard. And interestingly, Geoffrey, this was done with this wonderful architect called Lakidet Senanayake. They wanted the pool to be blue, and you couldn't get blue tile in Sri Lanka at that time. So Lucky went into Gaul and bought lots of bottles of milk of magnesia, and broke them up, and that's what the base of the pool is made from. So it's a very interesting house. It's not a totally inward-looking house. The half-captured gardens go out towards a sort of infinite landscape which surrounds the house. But there is this central core to it. The next house of importance was in 1962. Another de Silva, no relation, Ina de Silva's house. This was a plot in Cinnamon Gardens of 750 square meters, which seems very large, but at the time was thought small. The de Silva's friends told them it's far too small and far too expensive, but it's quite a large plot. But here, I think Bawa built the house that the Deranagalas really wanted. It's the house which is something quite new for Colombo, an inward-looking house, but it contains some of the elements of traditional domestic architecture. This is the plan, and we see here this, at the middle of everything, this very large courtyard, the Meda Medulla. We enter from the street through a loggia, and then here there's a courtyard on both sides, a single-story building which is mainly office and studio, but through here into this courtyard, and beyond is a 2-story building which is living accommodation on the ground, bedrooms above. This is the living space which is open to the courtyards on both sides of it. This is the dining space. And then this wall contains the service accommodation with a series of side courtyards. That's the entrance. First view you get, this long view into the courtyard, and that's the courts on both sides of the entrance. And then this is the main courtyard today. The view on the left looking towards the living room, the view on the right looking back towards the studio, and you can see there's a small courtyard with a tree breaking through it. And that's just 2 more views of the courtyard. And I wanted to include that because it's a part of the house that people don't usually see, but that's the long, raking service wing with a series of small courtyards. The next house is from 1967, and it was designed for a Swiss plantation firm. This is on a fairly isolated site. It's about 50, 60 miles north of Colombo. It was a coconut plantation. This is a scheme which has not been published in this country. It has appeared in a Danish journal. It was designed with Ulrich Plesner, and there's always been a dispute about authorship, sadly, but I've spoken to the client recently, and he is adamant that, in fact, this was Geoffrey Bawa's design, that no drawings were done. The building was, the whole concept was worked out on the site with sticks and string and built by Bawa. The company is called Bawa, but it's a different Bawa, B-A-U-R, and it was their workforce that built the house. But the interesting thing is that the site is covered with these huge boulders, and so what has happened is within this bit of plantation there's a sort of compound wall created. It's in the middle of nowhere, and then the various parts of the house are insinuated into these rocks. There is this little gateway which takes us, the main living room is where these rocks are, and then there's a guest wing and the bedrooms for the estate owner, and the office is here. And I think this is the first time that Bawa really came face to face with the idea of site, of a building which would grow out of a site, use rocks, actually be built amongst the rocks. But it's another part of a Sri Lankan tradition. There are lots of these rock temples, Buddhist temples, which are insinuated into boulders, between boulders. And this is the approach to the main living room. The slide on the left coming from the gateway, and that's the view ahead of you, is the big boulder which holds one end of the roof up. And then on the left, we see the living room. That's the approach. We come down the staircase, past the boulder, and that is the main living room. Open on the sides, except for hanging tacks to keep the monsoon rain out. And then this is the family wing, 2 stories, but built into the boulders. This is a house from the end of this period, 1969. It's the second model, the idea of the tower house. This is a very small plot. The client is a man called Peter Kenneman. He was a Marxist intellectual, communist member of parliament. And in fact, a year after this house was built, he became Minister of Housing. And then promptly put a ban on all private houses. But anyway, this was built, it's a 3-story house in which the normal accommodation is inverted, so that we have the living rooms on the top and the sleeping rooms in the middle. And there's a garage and office. His parliamentary office was on the ground floor. And this is this world that is created at treetop level, and this was to become another of Bawa's themes. The living room and its terrace high above the surrounding houses. Bawa has been like the Vicar of Bray. He's a sort of chameleon who has managed always to avoid taking sides in any of the religious or political or ethnic conflicts which have become a sad feature of life in Sri Lanka. And his own circle of friends and his office staff has always included people from every background. His partner, Pulagasundram, was a Tamil, and his close collaborators have included Sinhalese Buddhists, Muslims, Parsis, Burghers, a Dane, and even the occasional Brit. He's built schools for most ethnic religious groups. He has designed Catholic churches, Buddhist temples, and he's designed homes for for politicians of every hue and for individuals of every creed and community. In fact, he's in a way represents a sort of Ceylon which seems to be disappearing. This is the Banderwela Chapel of 1962. It was the first of a whole series of buildings which Bawa did for the nuns of the Good Shepherd Convent. It's a retreat chapel in the tea country for tired nuns. And this shows its rubble construction. The tower is in fact a light well that lights up the altar. And one side is of rubble, the other of glass, looking into a garden with the crucifixes in the window. And this is the nave of the church. Has this timber coffering and the top-lit altar. This white disc is something new. It's been added recently. The Stations of the Cross were made by Barbara Sansoni. Everything in the church was made either by the office or by Bawa's friends. And just a little detail, there are these vaults running down the side wall, and there is a slit behind the vault, which you can see in the right-hand slide, and this provides permanent ventilation to the chapel. During this period, Bawa did a series of educational buildings. This is the first, 1963, Bishop's College, in what you might call a sort of tropical AA modernist style. That's a contemporary picture on the right, and that's how it is today. Unfortunately, the ground floor has been filled in, but it's still very much as it was when it was built. The second of these school extensions is called St. Thomas's, on the seaside of Colombo, very exposed site. Originally, there was rather effective concrete relief by Ina de Silva's son. That's now sadly started to crumble because of the exposure, but the building is still there. And here we see developing a preoccupation with the section where the first floor overhangs the ground floor and the roof overhangs the first floor. The same theme developed rather idiosyncratically for a Montessori kindergarten. This is 1964, a very simple building with open plans on ground and first floor. The ground floor vaulted, toilet blocks contained as little cubicles, and here we see the vaulting of the ground floor and then the exposed roof of the first floor. And then the most interesting of these schools for me is this one, which is the extension to Ladies' College, where this stepping out section is really developed fully, and we see this on a number of Bawa's projects subsequently. Each floor cantilevers out a little bit, and then the top roof cantilevers out further, so that the walls can remain open for air and light, and there is no need for enclosing glass. And this is the classroom environment which is created. And these buildings had, I think, an enormous influence on school building in Sri Lanka, showing that it was possible to create a comfortable environment, excluding glass. And another building in this series from 1966, this is again for St. Bridget's Convent. It's a convent for a farm school for orphans, and it's built about 20 miles out of Colombo, and a stunning site. And Bawa has chosen to put the buildings on this hilltop. You arrive on the right-hand end of that plan, and this is where the nuns lived, and the chicken sheds were here, and then the convent girls lived in this dormitory, and these were the farm buildings. And this was one of the few real disappointments last year when I did set out to visit most of Geoffrey's buildings, to find that this was one building which was in very poor condition, no longer used as a convent farm school. But that's the chicken sheds on the left, and a view of the hillside as it was. That's the plan of the convent, and on the right, the sort of ablutions wing, and there was this is on the end here, there's a large courtyard, 2 dormitories, and this was, I think, the bakery. That shows the girls' dormitories, with in front of them a sort of ambalam, a sort of rest house. And that's a slide which one of a number which I've rescued from Colombo. I'm afraid things like slides deteriorate very quickly in Sri Lanka. That's a slide taken just as the buildings were being completed. And on the left, this is the girls' dormitory as it is today. And that was the priest's house on the left, and that's this little rest house on the right. Bawa's built about 10 hotels in Sri Lanka. We could have a long debate about the effects of tourism. Long-haul tourism arrived in Sri Lanka in the 1960s. I think that tourism would have been far more destructive in Ceylon had it not been for Bawa's interventions. This is not his first hotel. The first hotel was the Blue Lagoon of 1966. But this is the Bentota Beach Hotel. It's situated on a mound where there had once been a Dutch fort, and the plan there you can see there's a sort of a recreation of the form of the fort. The main hotel rooms are in fact one level above the entrance, and it's quite surprising to come up and discover the courtyard, the Medamidula, with a pool at first floor level. And then the rooms, the original rooms, the hotel's been extended since, but the original rooms were built as an L shape on 2 stories around 2 sides of that courtyard, with a pool beyond. This is the view as you arrive. You plunge into a cave, and then there is a staircase appears on your right, and this leads you up towards this batik ceiling by Ina de Silva, and you arrive at the reception. One lift ahead of you. This was something of an achievement to get a lift installed in Sri Lanka at that time, but of course the doors are custom made, designed by Ratnavabhusana. And then on the left we have this courtyard, the Medamidula, with the main living room, the main reception room ahead of you. And this was intended to be open and not air-conditioned, but it was later glazed in and air-conditioned to meet the requirements of the travel operators. That's the courtyard. And again we see the overhanging section, each floor cantilevering out to create shade and protection. And these are the reception rooms with hand-loom ceilings, which give the effect of a tent. And this is the roof material. Very often Bawa used half-round Sinala Ulu or Portuguese tiles on asbestos. And that's a view of the hotel from a later wing, and that just shows the base. Next door, at about the same time, he built a sort of cut-price hotel, very simple rest house type hotel, just straight in front of the sea, in the manner of a traditional rest house. The rooms facing the sea, courtyards separating them from the service wing. Porte cochere here, we enter across courtyards to the restaurant, and we find the rooms on either side. 2 stories. The lower rooms have this little covered loggia, and the upper rooms have a small balcony. And that's just an aerial view showing the main building and the courtyards and the service element with the porte cochere. That's the courtyard you cross, and here is the view from a room. Very simple. Again, this was intended not to be air-conditioned, and I've stayed in this hotel when it opened, and it was marvellously comfortable. But again, international tourism demands air conditioning, so these rooms have now been air-conditioned. And that's a more recent addition with a coffee house at the end of the pool. From this first period, a number of commercial buildings, office buildings. This is the AA building, not the Architectural Association, but the Ceylon Automobile Association, a building which I think Bawa was not very happy with. He says that it was not built according to his requirements. He'd hoped that the side walls would actually have timber lattice rather than concrete block. But it's quite a striking building still today. And then a rather strange project. This was a steel rolling mill which was built with Soviet aid, and because of political shenanigans it was built in a very unlikely place in the middle of really coconut estates, and it required a large lake for cooling the cooling water for the process. And Bawa was asked to design the office building. So it's a very simple single block which goes from the land into the water, but it has again this stepping out section. And these were photographs taken last year. It's been taken over by a Korean company, and they've glazed it in, and it's air conditioned, but it had functioned as a naturally ventilated building for quite a long time. That's just a view from the inside. The next period in Bawa's career I would call the Bandaranaike years, and this was the period of Mrs. Bandaranaike's government. It was a period of great austerity, and really during that 7-year period Bawa did not build a great deal in Sri Lanka, but this was the time when he started to build abroad in South India, in Bali, in Mauritius. I'm deliberately not showing projects from outside of Sri Lanka. So from this period, only 3 projects to look at. First, this house, the Stanley de Saram house, very rare for a private house to be built in this period. And it's a very inward-looking house, this very austere wall that surrounds it. It's something of almost like a Roman house in a way, with only the entrance for the car and the entrance for the visitor. That's the plan. Again, courtyard, second courtyard, and the long strip garden at the other side. So it's a completely contained house on an urban plot. And that's the main entrance. And here is the view, having gone through the door, very typical for Bawa, this axis, and the vista which shows you here first a space which is covered but open-sided, and then a room, and beyond that another space which is open to the sky, and then on either side of that axis a courtyard, an open to the sky room. That's just other views of that courtyard. And then another example of, I suppose you could say, Bawa's religious neutrality. Here he's designing a Buddhist temple, Sima Malika. It's a temple on a lake in Colombo. It has to be on a lake because it's used for the ordination of monks, and it's built on 3 platforms, a main platform connected by a bridge, and a second platform with small shrines, and off it the Dagoba, here the Mahabodhi tree, and a small office on the right. And it's a very beautiful little building which if you hold it in your mind, it seems to me it's a scale model for the Parliament project, which he was to build later. That's the central island podium. And it's clearly influenced by, Dennis was talking earlier about Seneca Bandanayake, who used to lecture at the AA. And Bandanayake had produced this study of the Anuradhapura monasteries. And clearly this has been very much influenced by Bandanayake's scholarship, the design of these podiums and so on. That's the interior of the main hall, and they're the small shrines. And then the last building from this series, from this period, I think of a most remarkable building, and it's astonishing that this has never been published. It was described last year in Australia by Ken Yang as probably the best example of a bioclimatically responsive tall building to be found anywhere in the world. And I suppose from Ken Yang that's high praise indeed. Why it has never been published, I just do not know. I guess it was omitted from the Brace Taylor book because it didn't really correspond to an image which was being put of Bawa as much more a sort of traditional vernacularist. I think it's a very interesting prototype for an office building in a tropical city. It's not too tall, it doesn't impose too much on the resources. It has a form which, from whichever side you look at it, has a different aspect. And that form scoops the breeze. And it has this quite complicated spandrel on each floor which acts as a filter for air. So it's a naturally ventilated building, or at least it was when it was built. It was built for the National Mortgage Bank, but later it was taken over by the Mahaweli Authority, and unfortunately it was air-conditioned. But these are just different views of it in the town, and here are drawings which were done recently. That just shows the plan form, and here is this spandrel panel so that air comes in underneath here and underneath here. I think there were problems with it, and it's a shame that it was never really adjusted by the clients. The architects were never given the chance to tinker with it. There were problems on the top 2 or 3 floors because sometimes in monsoon too much rain came in, but that could have been dealt with. And this is the top terrace with, you can see on the right, views out across Cinnamon Gardens, and here from this side the view of the Beara Lake. And it's, I think, a remarkable building, and it still impresses me today. Could we have the other slides, please? The next period that I want to show you, I would call the Jaya years. This is the period from 1977 to 1988. The UNP swept back into power in 1977, and Jaya became president, an office which he was to hold for 11 years. And there followed a period of economic liberalization, during which enormous development projects were instigated. The vast Mahaweli project supported new settlement in the dry zone, while the 100,000 houses program encouraged low-cost housing and planned urban development throughout the island. But unfortunately, this was also a period of increasing interethnic conflict, which developed finally into the intractable civil war which has been with us for the last 15 years. But this, for Bawa, was the period of les grands projets. Although he had enjoyed official patronage during the Bandanayake period, he still managed to find favour with the new government. This just shows a political archway, a pandal with J.R. Jayawardena, and this is his partner, Premadasa, who became his prime minister. And it was Jayawardena who built the new parliament. This was a period when very few houses were built by Bawa. He had, I think, probably too big projects to be involved with very many houses. But this is one house which I find very interesting indeed. Again, it's a house which has never been properly published. And the office have no photographs of it, but I was able to visit it last summer, but the owner, who sadly is a widow, she lost both her husband and her son in the Civil War, refuses to allow anybody to photograph it. But it's a remarkable house. It's called the Martenstein House, and it shows another side to Bawa. This is the beginning of what you might call his minimalist period. It's a house built in the corner of a garden, somebody else's garden, and you enter it from a carport along a long blind tunnel which is just top-lit. And then it's a tower house. Basically there's a living room, a double-height living room, with an upper living room here, the bedrooms, and then a wonderful roof terrace which is in the branches of a tree. And it's the interior of this house I just find quite astonishing and beautiful, but I can't show you any photographs of it. This is back to the canon of hotels. This is the Triton Hotel, which is on the coast beyond Bentota. You approach this hotel from a very busy road, along between walls and through coconut trees, and you see first this lake with trees growing out of it, and beyond that the foyer with a polished floor, and beyond that the swimming pool, and beyond that the sea. So the whole thing, rather theatrically you could say, has been engineered to give you this experience of a continuous reflected surface. But it is stunning. I mean, it works. And the other thing about this is that the rooms are arranged in these clusters, and to get to them, it isn't just a matter of going along a corridor. There is this series of courtyards, some of them at ground level, some of them at first floor level, and wonderful covered in verandas. This is the foyer and the reception. Here is the coffee bar and a staircase with drawings by Lucky Senanayaka. Oops. And the architecture is there's already been a shift. This is not the Sinhalese vernacular. It's almost an American colonial architecture, but quite restrained. But it seems to go very well with the spatial concept. These are the views you get from upper levels. And here, one of these courtyards. And here, an upper courtyard. This is a courtyard which is, in fact, 2 floors up from the ground. And then these big projects from this period, the next one, a whole university campus. Sri Lanka embarked during this period on a new university program. 6 new campuses were created. One of them in the south, the University of the South, Ruhunu, on an incredible site. This is the southern tip of Sri Lanka, the ocean. Here a rocky headland, and behind it rice paddy which could be drained to make a lake. And then the university on this sort of split hill with the science faculties on one side and the humanities on the other. And this was a project which I'm very conscious Michael Braun is here. He wrote a marvelous article about it in the Architectural Review when it was built. It was built by Dutch contractors. This was the period when Bawa could no longer simply rely on local craftsmen and going onto the site without drawings. This is a model, a photograph of a model which I found in the office. It's quite rare actually for Bawa to use models of this sort. And this is the campus. It's a series of pavilions, very much on a grid which is allowed to warp with the contours. And although at first sight it just seems to be a simple repetitive collection of pavilions, there is quite a lot of diversity in the spaces between the buildings, in the way they meet the site, and also the different buildings themselves. These are the science buildings, and this is the edge of the campus, and when you get to this edge you have this feeling of arrived at the edge of jungle in effect, or of plantation. And these are views down onto roofscapes. And here, if you look at that roof on the right, you can see that it's a central spine, which is a sort of corridor, and then these very narrow slits, which act as ventilators and illuminators. We see that here. That's the central corridor, and then these small slits, which bring in sufficient light. So bright is the sky. And courtyards. And then the most massive project of all, the Parliament building. This was the brainchild of Jaya, and the two of them, President Jaya and Bawa, I think together selected this site on the outskirts of Colombo at Kotte. This was a swamp which was drained by Dutch engineers, and the new Parliament built. As I say, it's almost like a scaled-up version of the Sima Malika. And it's a slightly disappointing building. I mean, it was built by Japanese contractors, 50,000 square meters of building in, I think, 3 years. And it was not the sort of building that Bawa was used to really designing. The concept is grand, but a lot of the detail is very thin. Sadly, it's also a building which we can't photograph, and Bawa's office have no photographs of this building. It's now a completely security cordoned off building. And in a sense, this is, I think, one of the sad things about it, that it's on this island, a marvelous concept, you could say, but it's come to symbolize the remoteness of government in Sri Lanka. It's totally cut off from the people. You cannot visit it. And this is a sketch, one of a series of early sketches that Bawa did of the concept, and this is an early office drawing. And one of the ideas was that the actual debating chamber would be at the middle of this, what seems to be a giant Kandyan audience hall, but that it would be transparent and that you would have these views out across the lake. But that was not realized, in fact, and I think partly for security reasons. And not surprisingly, because there have been this whole series of Shakespearean tragedies in Sri Lanka, but one was when somebody threw a grenade into the cabinet meeting in the new Parliament. These are slides that were, I think, taken by Richard Bryant. They were in the office in Colombo, and they're all covered in algae. I'm afraid things just rot away in Colombo. They haven't been looked after. That's the interior of the main debating chamber with this stretched aluminium tile roof and the chandelier by Lucky Senanayake. Well, the end of this period was marked by the exhibition at the RIBA and by the publication of Brace Taylor's book. And it also marked the end of the partnership with Pulagusundram and the end of the use of the title Edwards Reid Begg. Bawa dissolved the partnership. And it seemed to many people, I think myself included, that this meant that he was going into retirement. But in fact, nothing could have been further from the truth. He was, in fact, going solo. And so from 1988, 1989 onwards, he has worked from his home with a small group of people. This is a picture of him in his prime in the Edwards Reid Begg offices. The building was closed in 1988 and has remained closed ever since. And this is his way of operating today. He doesn't walk very easily. So this is Chana Daswata, his main assistant in the office. And most of his design work is done on site. Here he's looking at the Lydia Gunasekara house, which has recently been refurbished and altered. So this might have been just more of the same, but actually Bawa has continued to experiment and to produce new architecture. This is a house in Colombo for a lady called Chloe de Souza. It's another of the tower house types. This is the first floor, built above her offices, and it's mainly just a living room, a kitchen, and a terrace at both ends. And then a bedroom floor above that, and a terrace above that. And it's built on a small plot, next to other gardens, and there is this sense of living in the trees. And it uses, again, something quite new perhaps for Bawa, just standard metal section windows. But these are used very elegantly, so one feels almost that they become part of the treescape in the background. And then a house from 1996, the Jaya Koddy house. Jaya Koddy is a rather wealthy businessman married to Premadasa's daughter. A very strange shaped plot in the middle of Colombo. And we have here a combination of the courtyard and the tower type. It's the ground floor hugging this peculiar shaped site with an entrance, a courtyard here, and this courtyard, which is the bottom of a light and ventilation shaft, which goes up the entire 4 stories. And the ground floor is very cool, dark. It's almost like being at the bottom of a well. And then on the second floor, this large loggia roof terrace. And then on the floor above that, a last-minute addition, a roof terrace with a swimming pool. This is the house. This is Mrs. Premadasa's daughter. The entrance to the house. We go through and then we turn to the right to the main living room. And this is this world, almost subterranean, of rooms and courtyards contained by a wall. And this is the shaft which brings this blue light down into the dining room, but also acts as a chimney, so that there's constant ventilation. It acts as a stack. This is the first floor, the second floor terrace and loggia, and then above it a planted roof, and here the staircase going up to the swimming pool at the roof level. Then this is the most recent house, Jayawardena House. This is for the grandson of Jaya Jayawardena on the most incredible site, Marissa, the Red Cliffs of Marissa. The original house was burnt down at the end of the 80s. And what we have here is a single pavilion with a subterranean enclosed portion below the plinth and a small lower courtyard. But this is on this headland jutting out into the sea. And this was Geoffrey on site, sort of working out how the approach would be. The house itself has already appeared and is almost invisible. It's simply slender columns hiding in the trees and a horizontal roof. And this is it nearing completion. There's a staircase going down to the lower section, a plinth, and just a simple, gently sloping roof on columns. So it's quite unlike his earlier work. It seems to be a return to a sort of Miesian pavilion on this headland. I'd like to show you quickly two hotels that he's built in this period. This one was a very controversial project. It's the Llama Hotel. It's built on a tank. It's between Dambulla, which is a famous Buddhist temple, and further north, Sigiriya. So it's a very important tourist area. And his clients wanted a hotel on this tank which would service both of these tourist attractions. And it encountered a lot of opposition from particularly Buddhist clergy. This was a cartoon done in the office by a man called Samangala, suggesting that Geoffrey by this time was getting somewhat megalomaniac with his ideas, but he was determined to build this hotel project. And these are the drawings. Originally, the whole of the ridge comes down to the lake, and the whole hotel would have been beyond this sort of cave entrance. But in the end, the Buddhist clergy prevailed, so half the hotel is on one side of this gap, and the other half on this, and one approaches at the foot of this wing, and then you come to this cave entrance, and you go through, and then pow, you get this view of the lake and of Sigiriya. And this wing clings to the cliff, so that as you walk along the corridors, you have the rooms on one side and the cliff on the other. And it's a sort of quite a tectonic experience. It seems to grow out of the rocks. And the interesting thing is that it therefore is almost invisible from a distance, whereas on the other side of the lake, another hotel has been built in traditional Kandyan style, and its red roofs stand out like a sore thumb. But this building seems to have become part of the rocky landscape. This is the view of it as we approach. Here's this cave-like entrance which you go through the rock, and then to the other side you have this view of Sigiriya and these different pools at various levels. And here the rooms. The buildings sometimes cross the rocks on stilts, sometimes they're built into the hillside. And the roof is planted, the different levels planted. So it's starting now to lose itself into the landscape. This is the view of the against the cliff. And the views at the ends of the corridors. And this is the bathroom and the bedroom, both of which give you views out into the jungle. The other hotel, which has just been completed about a month ago, is called the Lighthouse Hotel. It's in Gaul. It's between a busy road and the sea. It's a very dangerous coast. You couldn't possibly swim there. Very noisy. You're always aware of the ocean here. This is the porte cochere, and then you enter into a drum, and Bawa's friend Lucky Senanayake has been allowed to go mad, and he's got this complete battle of the Sinhalese and the Dutch going up the staircase. And then the buildings themselves have a simplicity which is reminiscent of a European club or a rest house. Very sturdy, monsoon-proof furniture. And then the front wing of rooms shields a peaceful, protected courtyard. I'd like to very quickly then, I think I ought to hurry up now, but I'll show you very quickly the two very important projects which somehow have underpinned all of this work. One is the house that Bawa lives in Colombo, which is a Bagatelle Road, originally 4 small bungalows, which he acquired one by one. And then he got rid of this lane and created this labyrinth of small garden courts and rooms. And then demolished one house to create a sort of Le Corbusian maison citoyenne on the end. So part of it is this sort of traditional world of courtyards and verandas, and part of it is this tower. It's the two models brought together into one. I'll show you very quickly. This is the front door, with a design by Ismet Rahim, batik by Ina de Silva, car by Rolls and Royce. And this is a car which doesn't move, it's on chocks, and it's one of two cars. Here, this long corridor, which you haven't arrived yet, you're going to be taken to the middle of the building, but on the right, the door to the office and to the tower. But this light wells drawing you along the corridor, and then you turn right. Looking back, these are doors by Donald Friend. Crossing the axis to arrive then at the main central axis. And then here's the dining room. This is the main central axis, and then that's off to the left. And here's the staircase, a door by Ismet Rahim. And then this maison citoyenne that takes you up above the trees, this hanging out staircase, and then the top roof terrace. And here's the office today. This is where Geoffrey sits and bosses everybody from little courtyard. And here, the drawing office, where there's 2 or 3 people work with him. And then very quickly, I really oughtn't to keep you much longer. This is the garden which Bawa started in 1948 and which he's been playing with now for 50 years. It's a promontory into an island, the old rubber bungalow here, the rubber estate, through which he's cut this vista in order to see the temple which is on the hill in the distance there, removing part of the hill, the broad walk along the front, the Watergate, the Valley of the Jars. It's 25 acres, but it's a whole world. You can walk around it in 10 minutes, but you can also spend 2 weeks exploring it. I'll take you very quickly through it. That just shows the promontory, the temple, and the approach, which takes you in a circle. It's another game of blind man's buff, which brings you to the very heart of the composition. These are photographs by Christoph Bonn, who spent several years putting these photographs together to create a beautiful book. This is the approach to the estate. The entrance is hidden here. Then you arrive at these stairs, which to the right you could go towards the office, to the left up the stairs, onto this terrace where you get the view, which is being cut through the trees. A ha-ha, this Moonamal tree, a Dutch vase, and the Buddhist temple in the distance. And this is where Prince Charles would have had lunch last Wednesday, by the way. I don't know whether he was recruiting a new head for the Prince's School. Geoffrey seems to be in the right age group. But here's the Moonamal tree. Here's the ha-ha, looking back at the house. Here the interior of the house and this Aralia tree, which has been trained into a particular shape. Then the terrace, looking down onto the rice paddies and the Watergate. One of these open to the sky rooms. The office, the terrace outside of the office, and then looking back towards the office, this outer space, enclosed space, and view beyond. The Gothic court, the sculpture gallery. The terrace staircase is down to the lakeside. The rice paddy, the water garden, and looking back towards this figure which reminds you of where you've come from. And this, finally, this house, a recent house built 2 years ago, the house on the Cinnamon Hill, for a Belgian painter who rents it from him. Beautiful little house with this open bathroom and the bedroom with light coming in above the bed. And here's Geoffrey on his terrace surveying his garden, wondering what will happen to it when he's no longer there to look after it. And this is his visitor's book, 50 Years of Visitors. Bawa has been identified by critics variously as a tropical modernist, a romantic, a vernacularist, and a regionalist. This problem of labelling has not been helped by his own mistrust of theory and his reluctance to discuss his work. He has written, "When one delights as much as I do in planning a building and having it built, I find it impossible to describe the exact steps in an analytical or dogmatic way. I have a very strong conviction that it is impossible to explain architecture in words. I've always enjoyed seeing buildings, but seldom enjoyed reading explanations about them, as I feel with others that architecture cannot be totally explained, but must be experienced." It's important to place Bawa in a context, not a historic context, but rather the context of contemporary Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's population has almost tripled since independence, while its communities have been fractured by bitter political and ethnic disputes. Although it might be thought that his buildings have had no direct impact on the lives of ordinary people, Bawa has exerted a defining influence on the emerging architecture of the newly independent Sri Lanka and on successive generations of young Sri Lankan architects. In this way, his ideas have spread out across the island like ripples on a pond and have provided a bridge between the past and the future, a mirror in which ordinary people have been able to obtain a clearer image of their own emerging culture. Thank you. Yeah, sure, of course.
Well, that was a very stimulating and very thorough analysis. I can only hope that his publisher publishes a book that's going to provide us an insight into that photography, wonderful photography, and a wonderful analysis. Now we have a chance, I think, for the next 10 minutes or so to extract a bit more information from you, David. And open it up. No questions about this extraordinary architect, this extraordinary island? Well, I must thank you very much again. Thank you very much for your talk, and there will be a chance to talk to David upstairs at the bar for the next quarter of an hour or so. Thank you.
Thank you very much.